Wang Chao was having a bad day in the best possible way. It wasn't the kind of bad day where you get fired or your car gets stolen, but rather the kind where you're on the verge of accomplishing something no one has ever done before, and every step you take towards success is a little more absurd than the last. He stood in his cramped lab, his fingers dancing over a sleek control panel with more buttons than the cockpit of a fighter jet. In front of him, a vial of serum glowed faintly, pulsating as if alive, daring him to make the next move. "You know this is a terrible idea, right?" he said to himself, half smiling as he gazed at the experimental concoction. The serum was supposed to make him better, faster, stronger, all the things society said it wanted. It was the next logical step in human evolution, and yet, here he was, on the verge of turning his body into something out of a science fiction novel. Wang Chao wasn't exactly what you'd call an athlete, but his mind was sharp. Brilliant, even. At least, he used to think so. Now, as the serum settled into his veins, he couldn't help but wonder if his genius had pushed him too far. He had always felt that human beings were limited, trapped by their biology, their emotions. With this serum, however, he believed he could break free, he could rewrite the rules of the game. With one last deep breath, he injected the serum into his bloodstream, the cool liquid slipping into his veins like a promise. The moment it entered his system, everything went dark. The lab around him spun, the walls shifting and bending like mirages in a desert. His heart thudded in his chest, the noise so loud he swore the entire building could hear it. Then, without warning, his vision exploded into clarity. It wasn't just that his eyesight had improved, it was as if every atom in the room was suddenly visible to him, each molecule of air dancing in front of his eyes like fireflies in a dark night. The edges of the lab became razor-sharp, the smallest details, the dust particles in the air, the scratches on the lab's metal tables, became clear and vivid. For a moment, Wang Chao simply stared, awestruck. He could see the fibers of his own clothing, the tiny hairs on his forearms, the way his breath moved the air around him, but then, things started to get out of hand. He could see everything. Too much. The distant hum of the fluorescent lights. The subtle twitch of his colleague's finger in the adjacent room. The shifting shadows of a mouse scurrying in the far corner. Every single detail clamored for his attention, each one demanding to be noticed, pulling him in 100 different directions at once. His mind, previously so sharp and focused, began to fray at the edges. Wang Chao gritted his teeth. "Focus," he muttered, trying to regain control. But the sight of his colleague, Dr. Zhang Mei, moving in the hallway outside his lab, distracted him. Her every motion seemed magnified, too precise, too delicate, like a dancer caught in slow motion. He couldn't look away, even as the sounds around him crescendoed, growing louder and louder until they filled his skull. His heart raced, his hands trembling as he swiped at the nearest desk to steady himself. But instead of simply brushing it aside, his palm slammed into the edge of the table with an unexpected force, sending the entire thing flying across the room. It crashed into a stack of research papers, knocking over beakers and vials, some of which shattered on the floor. The chaos was overwhelming. His breathing quickened. He could feel the adrenaline surge through him, flooding his body like a drug. The strength in his muscles surged too, far beyond what he had expected. He was stronger now, like an ant capable of lifting 50 times its body weight. But unlike an ant, he had no control over the power. His body was a runaway train. "Great," he muttered, stumbling backward and knocking into a wall. The sensation was surreal. The walls seemed to shift, the floor rising and falling beneath his feet. Just great. At that moment, his mind flickered between lucidity and pure instinct. His hawk-like vision and cheetah-like reflexes were no longer an asset. They were liabilities. The world around him seemed distorted, his body moving too fast, too erratically. He took a deep breath, trying to steady himself, but everything felt like it was spinning out of control. This wasn't what he had envisioned. This wasn't evolution. This was madness. And then, just like that, the effect began to wear off, or so he thought. The dizziness ebbed away, leaving behind only a tingling sensation, a strange residue in his body. The lab was a mess, papers and equipment scattered across the floor. He took a tentative step forward, trying to steady his shaky legs. But as he moved, something felt off. The floor beneath him felt too soft, too yielding. Without thinking, Wang Chao's foot came down harder than he had intended. The sound of cracking would echoed throughout the lab. He looked down in horror. The floorboard had buckled beneath his weight, splintering like a twig under the paws of a lion. What the hell? Wang Chao muttered, stepping back. The power coursing through his body felt wrong. Too much. He tried to remind himself that this was the next step, that he had transcended the limits of his own biology. But the more he thought about it, the more unsettled he became. He had never wanted to be a freak of nature. He wanted to be better. And now, he had no idea who he was anymore. The door to the lab creaked open, and Dr. Zhang Mei stepped in, her face a mixture of concern and disbelief. Wang Chao, she began, her voice steady but filled with uncertainty. Are you all right? He turned toward her, his mind foggy with conflicting thoughts. I'm fine, he said, but his voice came out too sharp, too abrupt. I just need a minute. Zhang Mei looked at him, her eyes narrowing slightly. You're not fine. What did you do? Her gaze swept over the chaos around him, the broken equipment, the damaged lab. I'm testing something, Wang Chao said, his tone defensive. I'm testing the serum. It's working, I can feel it working. My senses, they're sharper than ever. Zhang Mei crossed her arms. And your control over them? What about that? You can barely walk across the room without causing a disaster. This is not normal, Wang Chao. He swallowed hard, his mind racing. It was true. He had no control. But he wasn't ready to admit that. Not yet. Instead, he focused on his new abilities, the thrill that came with them. His speed, his strength. It all felt like power. But what use was power if you couldn't control it? I'm fine, he said again, more forcefully this time. Just, leave me alone for a bit. I need to think. Zhang Mei hesitated, her expression softening. All right. But you need to stop. Whatever you're doing, it's not just dangerous, it's reckless. She left, the door clicking shut behind her. Wang Chao remained standing in the wreckage of his lab, a new wave of panic rising in his chest. He was no longer sure whether he was in control of himself, or if his own abilities had started to take over. Something was changing inside him, something deeper than the physical transformations, something was shifting. Wang Chao stood in the aftermath of his experiment, his lab in disarray. The walls, now cracked and dented, seemed to close in around him. His mind raced with thoughts that didn't seem to belong to him, or at least, not the man he had been before. He could feel the rush of adrenaline still coursing through his veins, like a constant hum beneath his skin. The heightened sense of awareness, the precision of his vision, the wild energy coiling in his muscles, it was intoxicating, but unsettling. It was as though the world around him had become too real, too vivid. He couldn't separate the noise in his head from the noise in the world. Everything demanded his attention. Everything screamed for him to act. His fingers twitched, and without thinking, he reached for the nearest chair, lifting it effortlessly and tossing it across the room, watching it crash into the wall. He felt a burst of satisfaction, a fleeting surge of power. But it was followed by a wave of shame. What had he become? The hum of the fluorescent lights overhead buzzed in his ears, louder now, like an insect too close to his face. The walls seemed to pulse with a life of their own. His hawk-like vision picked out every detail, the lines on the walls, the flicker of a shadow in the corner, the faint crack in the window that had gone unnoticed before. And yet, he couldn't focus on any one thing. His thoughts were scattered, flitting from one fragment to the next, never resting long enough to settle into clarity. His breathing was shallow, quick, too fast, too shallow. He needed to calm down, but the animal instincts inside him were too strong that he was no longer sure whether his mind was his own. With each passing moment, it felt like something deeper, something primal, was awakening inside him. The strength of the ant. The speed of the cheetah. The vision of the hawk. These abilities, once the product of a carefully constructed plan, had become the driving force behind his behavior, pushing him to act impulsively, recklessly. It was as though his body no longer belonged to him. It was his instincts, the raw, untamed power of the animals he had borrowed traits from, that were in control. He paced the room, back and forth, like a caged animal. The door to the lab was closed, but it felt as though the walls were closing in, as though the air was becoming thick, suffocating. He needed to get out, to run, to move. The impulse was overwhelming. His body itched with the need to test his limits, to see just how fast he could go, how far he could push himself before breaking. His thoughts drifted back to Zhang Mei, the warning in her voice still echoing in his mind. Reckless, she had said. Dangerous. But was it dangerous? Or was it just a sign of his potential? He could feel the power inside him, a force waiting to be unleashed. It wasn't reckless, it was evolution. He had taken control of his destiny, and now, nothing could stop him. He turned and, before he could think better of it, sprinted toward the door, his legs moving faster than he'd ever felt before. The lab blurred around him, the walls melting away as he surged forward. He was out the door in a heartbeat, down the hallway in another. He barely noticed the shocked faces of his colleagues as they scattered out of his way, too stunned to react. The cold air outside hit him like a slap, but it felt good. He took a deep breath, the rush of oxygen filling his lungs, and for a moment, he felt clear, calm. But the moment was fleeting. The urge to run, to move faster, grew stronger. He shot down the sidewalk like a blur, his feet barely touching the ground as he weaved between pedestrians, their confused shouts ringing in his ears. His body was moving on its own, as if it had its own mind, and he couldn't, or didn't want to, stop it. It felt like freedom. It felt like power. He reached the edge of the city, the streets giving way to the open space of the park. Without slowing, he took a sharp turn and bounded up a set of stairs, the muscles in his legs burning as he launched himself upward, higher, faster than he ever thought possible. The wind whipped against his face, but it didn't slow him down. He was faster than any person had the right to be. His legs moved with the speed of a predator, his breath coming in short bursts, his heart pounding in his chest, but it wasn't enough. He wanted more. More speed. More power. More of everything. Then, as quickly as it had begun, it stopped. The ground beneath him suddenly felt wrong. A patch of ice, slick and unexpected, caught his foot. His reflexes, lightning quick as they were, couldn't compensate in time. He slipped, his body careening toward the ground, but he couldn't stop it. The impact hit hard, sending a shockwave of pain through his spine. He rolled, instinctively trying to regain control, but his legs wouldn't respond. The air was knocked from his lungs, and for a moment, he lay there, panting, disoriented. The world around him seemed to shift, the edges of reality blurring and bending. He slowly sat up, his body screaming in protest. There was something in his chest now, a gnawing sensation. He looked at his hands, flexing them, watching as his knuckles cracked and shifted unnaturally. His bones were aching, his muscles twitching with the aftershock of the fall. His vision, still razor-sharp, flickered as though it couldn't focus properly. The world around him was alive in a way he hadn't experienced before, but now, it felt too much. Too intense. His heart raced. Panic set in. What had he done? Wang Chao pushed himself to his feet, unsteady at first, then with more certainty. He had to get back to the lab, to figure out what had gone wrong. This wasn't the future he had envisioned. This wasn't evolution. This was something else, something uncontrollable. The very abilities that had promised him transcendence had turned into a curse. He could feel them inside him, gnawing at his psyche, urging him to act, to move, to destroy. He could feel the shift in his mind, the animal instincts taking over. He turned toward the city, his movements erratic. Zhang Mei's face flashed before his eyes, her warning still ringing in his ears. He could hear her voice, calm but firm. "You need to stop, Wang Chao. This isn't you anymore. You're losing yourself." The wind picked up again, biting at his skin, but it did little to cool the heat building inside him. He was too far gone. He couldn't stop it now. He couldn't stop what he had started. The world was too bright, too sharp. His senses were overloaded. He needed to get back to the lab, to find a way to reverse what he had done, but his legs weren't his own anymore. He was no longer in control. He was becoming something else. Wang Chao stumbled through the streets, his senses no longer just heightened but stretched to their limits. Every crack in the sidewalk, every rustle of wind through the trees, felt as though it were happening directly inside his skull. He could see every detail, the texture of the bricks on a nearby building, the faint pattern in the clouds overhead, the heartbeat of a pedestrian who walked by, their pulse quickening as they looked at him, but none of it made sense. His mind was scrambling to keep up, unable to focus on any one thing long enough to fully understand it. The world was too vivid, too alive. His body was on autopilot, moving with an energy that was impossible to contain. The pavement beneath his feet cracked with each step as his newfound strength propelled him forward, faster than any man should be able to run. The muscles in his legs burned with each stride, but there was no exhaustion. He had no idea where he was going, only that he needed to get away. Away from the people who had once trusted him, away from the life he had once known. The city seemed to fade into the background as he picked up speed, the world around him becoming a blur. He crossed streets without even noticing, dodging cars and pedestrians with an instinctive precision that felt animalistic. His senses, the hawk's vision, the cheetah's speed, were no longer tools of enhancement. They had become his new reality, driving him forward with an urgency he couldn't control. The urge to run, to push himself further, deeper, became overwhelming. He didn't even hear the shouts of confusion and fear from the people he passed. They were nothing but background noise, irrelevant to the rhythm of his body and the demands of the animal instincts roaring inside his mind. It wasn't until he reached the edge of the city, the place where buildings and streets gave way to the outskirts, where the lights dimmed and the noise quieted, that he finally slowed. He stood at the threshold, panting, his hands clenched into fists, his chest rising and falling with each jagged breath. The world around him was so still, so quiet. He could hear every insect, every rustle of the leaves, every movement in the underbrush. His mind, which had been a storm of chaotic thoughts just moments before, now felt eerily calm, but in a way that was deeply unsettling. That he took a few shaky steps forward, and that's when it hit him. The primal, raw power that he had been cultivating, the strength that had once felt so empowering, was now a danger. He felt it in his chest, a deep, gnawing sensation that came from something inside him. Not just the power in his muscles or the speed in his legs, but something darker. A hunger. His mind flickered, torn between the desire to fight the pull of his new instincts and the overwhelming urge to give in. He wanted to run, but not just for the sake of speed. No, there was something more. He could feel it in the tightness of his limbs, the twitch in his hands, the fire in his blood. His animal side was calling to him, whispering to him to give in. To hunt. To dominate. But he was still himself, wasn't he? He had to be. This power, this raw, unfiltered strength, it was supposed to make him better, not turn him into something he could barely recognize. He reached for his phone, his hands shaking as he dialed the number that had once meant safety, a tether to the life he had known before this all began. Zhang Mei. The phone rang. Once. Twice. A third time. She answered. Her voice was low, cautious. Wang Chao. I don't know what's happening to me, he said, his voice coming out too harsh, too desperate. I don't know if I can stop it. I can feel it, the power, the need, it's taking over. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Where are you? Near the edge of the city, he muttered, looking around, disoriented. I don't know how to get back. I don't know what's happening to me, May. Zhang Mei's voice softened, but there was an underlying firmness to it. Listen to me. You need to stop. This isn't you. This thing, these abilities, whatever they are, they're not just changing your body, Wang Chao. They're changing who you are. I can't, he said, shaking his head, though she couldn't see him. I can't stop it. I've crossed a line, May. I can feel it in my bones. I'm becoming something else. Another silence. This time, it felt like the calm before a storm. You still have a choice, she said quietly. You can choose to turn this around. But you have to come back. Now. He gripped the phone tighter, his nails digging into his palm. She was right. He still had a choice. But that choice felt so small, so distant, compared to the feral hunger he could feel clawing its way out of him. His breath hitched. His gaze sharpened, distant. He could see something. The movement of a small animal, darting through the trees just beyond the city limits. It wasn't a person, but it might as well have been. He could feel its heartbeat, its terror, its every tiny movement. It was prey. Wang Chao, Zhang Mei's voice cut through his thoughts. Come back. Please. But it was too late. His mind, which had been teetering on the edge, slipped further. The animal instincts were winning. The hawk, the cheetah, the ant, they were all stronger than the man he had been. He dropped the phone, his hands trembling with a mixture of fear and anticipation. The hunt had begun, but he was already moving before he could think, his legs carrying him into the woods at a speed no human could maintain for long. His body, now beyond exhaustion, was still driven by an unnatural force. The trees blurred around him, the world nothing more than a maze of colors and sounds that made no sense. But that small animal was still there, its heartbeat thumping in his ears like a drum. It was scared. It was alone. It was, he pushed harder, faster, until he was almost airborne, his feet barely touching the earth as he followed the scent, the vibrations in the ground, the whispers of movement on the wind. He wasn't thinking anymore. He was hunting. The creature broke through the underbrush just ahead of him, its body low to the ground, its small form darting between the trees. His vision locked onto it, his every sense honed to perfection. He closed the distance in seconds. It barely had time to react before he was on it, his hands reaching out, grabbing its neck in a vice-like grip. The world went silent for a moment. The wind stilled. The creature's pulse thudded in his ears, the scent of fear thick in the air. And in that moment, he felt everything, the rush of victory, the surge of power. It wasn't just the speed, the strength, the vision. It was the control. He was in charge. And yet, as the realization hit him, something deeper stirred inside. The crushing weight of what he had become. This wasn't evolution. This wasn't the future of humanity. This was madness. This was a beast, and he was the one it had turned into. He released the animal, watching it scurry off into the night, trembling, free. Wang Chao stood frozen, his chest heaving, the last vestiges of his humanity clinging to the fading edges of his mind. His eyes, sharp and clear, scanned the darkness. He felt empty. Hollow. Like he had broken a part of himself he couldn't get back. The hunt had given him everything he thought he wanted. And now, he realized, it had taken everything away.